Hi everyone and welcome. We're in my wormery and it's time to feed. And if you're like me, then you usually decide that it's time to feed based on one basic thing. There's no more room in the refrigerator to keep storing the stowed away materials that you're going to feed with next. So for me, it's been 8 days since the last time I fed. And during that last feeding, the two oldest of my bins, the ones that are right here behind me, the ones that are now at the age of about 6 months and 5 months old, they're almost at the same stage in terms of being ready. They're both fairly far along, and I've been flip-flopping on these a little bit. A couple weeks ago I decided it was time to wind down, and then during the last feeding I just treated it like all the others and I just threw some food in there. What I'm going to do with those now is I'm really going to get back into the mode of trying to wind these down. And by doing that, I'm actually going to not feed. They're not going to get any of this food today. And for that matter, I'm going to pop in on them really quick, just take a peek at how they're doing. But I'm also going to extract those slow composting food items. The only food in those is going to be any sort of remaining bits of small uncomposted material so that they really have a chance to seek out those little remaining bits and break that down, and then I'll really be able to start considering those bins as having nothing but finished compost. The two bins back here, the two newer ones, those I'm going to treat like any other feeding. I'm just going to use the food that I've got here, frozen vegetables and fruits from about a week's worth of kitchen scraps. I've got some used coffee grinds here. I'll also include some grit this go around. I believe it's been a couple of feedings since the last time I included eggshell grit. And this tray is just here so that when I do the check-in on the two oldest bins, I could use this to retrieve those slow composting food items, the corn cobs, and I think there might even be a mango pit in there, and include it in the feeding when I get to these two newer bins. What we have down here, it's some finished compost, which I had just taken out of what I was referring to as a finishing tray. But this stuff was a little bit fishy to me. It had like a little bit of a musty smell to it, and it also had this little kind of white haze to it, a little bit of moldy appearance. And I did post a video and ask for feedback, and I liked one of the ideas, which was to introduce the material back into a couple of the active bins. And I believe that the mold that might be kind of developing on there will actually be treated as food by the worms that are in these active bins. And I think that's going to revive that material and give it a new lease on life. Put it back into service and hopefully kind of get rid of that musty smell, and that'll really, I think, hopefully alleviate any concerns that I have. So we're going to start with the two oldest ones so we can do the extraction of the old slow composting food items, and then we'll go ahead and take all these food items as well as that old compost and incorporate that into the feeding to these two newer bins that are back here. So, all right, a lot of explanation. Sorry for the chit chat. Let's get these bins out here and get to work. Okay, so we're starting with the oldest of my bins. This bin is dating back to February at this point, late February, so it's over 6 months old at this point since we are now in early August. And if you've been following my channel, then you'll understand what I've got going on here. I wanted to sort of create a sort of a baiting area to try to lure out the mites that I've been observing in my bins. And then I thought that if they kind of started to congregate around what I had laid out as a lure, then they'd eventually stumble on some of this diatomaceous earth that I laid out, and that would eliminate the mites. So here and there I am observing one or two, kind of still cruising around, but certainly not as many as I had seen previously. So maybe this is kind of working, I'm not sure, but I didn't want to abandon this approach quite yet. I wanted to just let it kind of run its course and just observe what kind of progress I make with this. So for now I'm just going to restore this once we're done here. But yeah, like so I said earlier, I'm really just looking to do kind of a retrieval of the food items that are in here so that this bin can really kind of get into a wind down mode. So this side over here appears to be the side where I last fed. If you've been watching my channel in the past, you'll know that I'd usually mark the feeding zone with a coffee filter, but I don't have that here right now. I was just worried that the mite eggs, I just worried that the coffee filter might also be infested with the eggs of the mites. So I wanted to just remove that when I was trying to prep for combating the mites, and that's the main reason you don't see a feeding zone indicator. Luckily, it's usually pretty easy to see where the feedings are happening, because that's where you see a more moist kind of a upper surface, and that's where you also see a lot of very fine vermicompost on the upper surface. So now, it was about a week ago that we fed here last, and I did make an extra effort to try to add only those types of foods that would be kind of fast to break down. So those were all kind of soft leafy materials, banana peels, lettuce, things like that. So my hope is that we're not going to encounter much, if any, of that. And hopefully the only real food items we're going to find are these here, which are the mango pit and this corn cob. It's going to poke around a little bit just out of curiosity to see if in fact that's where we're at. I guess some of the paper that we used for bedding is also still present here. But other than that, I believe we are kind of seeing what we had expected to see here, which is little or no signs of the remaining food. Okay, and it's because there's still stuff like this. There's little scraps of shell, for that matter. Maybe things like that should also just be pulled out while I'm in here, and those will be incorporated into these newer bins so that they have ample time to break down. Here, this is just the stem of a banana peel. I'm not going to worry about removing that. If it's come this far in a week's time, within a couple more days, it should just be gone already. So let's just take another quick glance through this remainder of the feeding zone. If I see anything other than just little pieces of paper bedding, then maybe we can extract them as well. But I think the worms have done a pretty good job of breaking down everything that was in here. So let's just take a quick peek on this other side, where this opposite side of where the feeding zones were happening. It's a little bit drier here because there's not been any food added lately on this side, but there's still an abundance of worms in here. This is just a little bit more bedding, paper. Not going to worry too much about it. I'm just going to let it stay within the bin. Hopefully it'll get broken down as the worms start to really deplete what remaining food there is. They'll find that to be quite adequate as far as a supply of food is concerned. So since there's really no feeding zone at this point, maybe it would be a nice idea to sort of blend in some of this more moist stuff and more heavily populated stuff from where the feeding zone was over to this side, and bring over some of this more dry stuff from the other end over to where the feedings have been occurring and the more high moisture levels are. And then we'll have kind of a more even spread of moisture throughout the bin. This is what I guess is just another hunk of a mango shell, so I think that's a fair game item to remove, since it's kind of a slow composting item, which is most likely not going to break down anytime soon. Because at this point I'd really like to see this material kind of wind down and kind of become compost only. A lot of worms over here. I must have hit a hot spot where there might have been some food laying around. Alright, so the other reason I want to kind of spread the moisture around too is that I do want to let this material dry a bit more. so that it becomes kind of a less appealing environment for the mites. I believe it's still adequately moist to make it comfortable for the worms, but I'd like it to be a little bit less damp, just because I think that that would help reduce the mite infestation that I observed in my bins recently. Okay, let's get the cover back on here. And I guess, you know, as long as this is still sort of the active strategy that I'm employing, whether it's going to work or not, I don't know, but as long as we're still sticking to this game plan, this piece of banana peel is kind of at its end, so I'm just going to put another little tiny piece in there just to keep the appeal of it up, keep it interesting for the mites, so hopefully they'll keep being attracted to that. All right, let's do the same with the other second oldest bin. Again, I feel like I'm just spending a lot more time doing this than I'd originally planned. Just can never seem to resist goofing around and spending time playing around with my bins. So what have we here? I see a mite crawling around over there. For all I know, they could be within the folds of this piece of cardboard, but other than that one, I didn't really see much. I see one here. It's hard to tell. Is there possibly any cruising around down under here? All right, so it's hard to say. Maybe the diatomaceous earth is in fact doing what I had hoped it would do, which is reduce the numbers or kind of knock them out. Knock them down at least, but let's get a little piece of banana peel back on here and pull this off to the side. So now sticking to the game plan, there's just, you know, chestnut shells in here. This bin definitely has a lot more scraps all over the top surface here. All kinds of I guess pumpkin seeds for the most part. I'm just wondering if I should really bother trying to remove all of it. Maybe what I can do though is kind of round up all of this loose matter off the top of the surface here. And kind of maybe kind of sink it down under the surface to keep it kind of down where the worms are instead of up on the top surface, and maybe it'll get the exposure that it needs to be consumed rather than being at the top where the worms might not be so inclined to go after it. Once again, this was the feeding zone here, and really all I'm after is to retrieve that slow composting piece of food, which is should be just a corn cob. See some remaining scraps of paper in here. Seems to be paper. Maybe even parts of what was fed most recently, but here's that corn cob. Definitely looks like it's getting whittled down nicely. We're going to pull it out just to stick with the plan, and just going to take another peek down in here. It does seem like here's another piece of chestnut shell, slow composting type material. It does seem like there's more paper and uncomposted, maybe a piece of banana peel as far as I can tell. Some paper, some newspaper, some bedding. So this bin might still be just a little bit behind. Doesn't seem to be processing stuff quite as fast as the other one that we just looked at is doing, which is fine. So here I'm maybe not going to agitate the material around the way I did in the other one, so as to kind of encourage the worms to keep eating down in this area here. What I'll do is I'll just take this stuff that I collected off the top surface and scatter it down inside that in that area. So I will kind of treat that as an ongoing feeding zone, at least for now, in the hopes that maybe by the next time we pop in on this bin that we won't see much, if anything, remaining. And then I guess we'll try to shovel all these worms that I displaced from that feeding area back into that general space, so that hopefully we don't distract them from their task at hand, which is eating. Just take a quick peek at how things look at what used to be the old feeding zone on this side. It's kind of like what we always see, which is just massive worms. It's not nearly as dry or depopulated as we saw in the oldest of my bins. And that might just be attestable to the fact that there might still be some remaining food scraps down there as well that they're still working on. I guess until that's gone, they've got no reason to leave, so they'll stay there until there's no more food remaining for them. The key here was that we're not adding any additional new food, and we've removed what was, I guess, the largest food item that was in here. And we're also going to give this material a chance to dry out as well. So let's go ahead and cover this one up too. I think as far as these two bins are concerned, though, it does seem like the mite situation is better than it was originally, or at least a couple weeks ago, better than it was a couple weeks ago. So it looks promising. I'm glad to see what I'm seeing here. Okay, now this bin has the same sort of setup, right? So let's just take a quick peek at how things are progressing on this one. The idea here was that the mites were hopefully going to get drawn to the lure, which is the banana peel. The diatomaceous earth surrounding the area was meant to help wipe them out. And in this case, I could see a larger number of mites cruising around over here. So some over here too. Over here as well. So it's difficult to say for sure. Usually I think these chewed out sections on the paper are usually indications that that's where the mites are working the hardest, because they just seem to chew away any paper they get their little jaws on. So for now, this is not really about dealing with the mites, so I'm not going to sweat it for now. I'm just going to treat it as a chance to observe how things are coming along. But I am going to try to, continue with what was happening here, which is to try to keep the mites coming to this area, using the diatomaceous earth to maybe knock out some of them, but at a certain point use the paper and the gathering of them to just eliminate them, to move them off, get them out of here. It still feels like we're making pretty good progress. So now you could see here no feeding zone indicator, but if you can tell, the middle section here, which is where I fed last, definitely has signs of it being the most current feeding zone, just because of the higher degree of moisture and the castings only across the top of the surface. I guess we'll stick to what we normally do, which is knock out these sprouts when we find them. And interesting, sprout didn't know which direction to grow, so it looks like the roots were on the surface and it was growing downwards for some reason. But whatever, not growing anymore. It's worm food at this point. The game plan, if you'll recall, was to not only feed, but to also put some of that so-called finished compost, which is not really looking so good because of the moldiness of it, back into service. So I'm going to open up the middle here. I'm going to lay in some bedding to start. So why don't we just start peeling back some of this material so we can expose the middle section, which is kind of where the feeding zones have been occurring. These bins are riddled with slow composting food items like mango pits and corn cobs. So we'll just take some of those items out here and rest them off on the side. But it is nice to see that, corn cobs are making good progress. Anytime you snap one in half, you can see the worms are working them from the inside out. And and the overall diameter seems to be reducing on them as well. So they're definitely making good progress, but it just takes time. You need to be patient with the corn. Okay. So I'll just move some of these little guys out of the feeding zone and pile them up over on this side. Okay. I've got some newspaper that I'm going to lay down in the middle over here for bedding. It's also a couple of old coffee filters. Okay. So now before I feed, I'm going to, on top of this bedding, I'm going to questionable moldy compost. So let's just take about half of what's in this bucket. Here's the cork. We always stumble on the cork. And for now, we'll just keep it in service. We're going to put it back down here in the middle. So now, before we cover up with some of this other material, let's go ahead and lay in a little bit of grit. A nice generous portion of food, which also happens to include another slow composting food item, another piece of corn, all this corn silk too. And grab a handful of banana peels too. Well, it's a pretty generous feeding, so yeah, this is an extremely generous feeding, so kind of by design, on purpose. So let's just take some of the known good material and start piling it up on top to cover. And at the same time, I'm just going to aerate what's here on the sides a bit too. And we'll just start moving in what's over on the sides here, which included the majority of the worms as well. We'll kind of get them all back down into the middle section here, and then kind of aerate whatever else is left off here on the sides. See worms everywhere, pretty highly populated bin here too. It's not that old of a bin, it's only about 3 months old at this point, so I'd like for it to have an ample food supply and keep all these worms busy. So we'll just go ahead and cover up as is. It's a little bit of a mound here in the middle, but I think that's going to collapse once the worms get to work on the food and start depleting what's in there. Whatever. We're returning the paper that is known to have the mites on the top of it, but not many as far as I can tell, and I think the jury is still out in terms of how good or bad the mites are, so I'm not going to worry too much about it for now. So let's get the other bin out here and do the same. Okay. So now the last of our bins to be fed here is, well, not last, because I'm going to also feed my little nursery bin that I've got some European night crawlers in. So I want to put a little food in there too, but I want to see how the mites are looking here. Definitely looks like there's a concentration of mites hanging out over there, and that might be because if you look around, the diatomaceous earth is everywhere else except over here. So it seems to be like a little bit of a haven for them, a chance to get away from what's kind of problematic, which is the diatomaceous earth. So maybe I can just tap a little bit of it off the cardboard here. I don't know, whatever. For now, I'm not really here to deal with the mites. I'm just sort of checking in to see how things are progressing as far as they're concerned. But yeah, in this one I could see this one appears to have the greatest number of mites. So here I had just done a little bit of housekeeping, and I threw a little bit of paper that I collected from somewhere and threw it in here. The feeding zone here should be like the last one we just fed, which is down the middle. And I believe that when I emptied the bait bomb out of my finishing tubs, or out of my last finishing tub, I had placed that bait bomb in here, at least the newspaper that had made up the bait bomb, to put it in here as bedding. So we might find a piece of fairly fresh paper in here. But I've got another piece of paper we could use in here as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to scoop out a lot of these slow composting food items that are in here down near the bottom. Some of these mango seeds just look so different from the others. To me, it almost seems like when it gets this hairy sort of appearance that it's really getting broken down good. It's really down to the fibers, and I bet you that's part of why they like it, because it does have some very fine, thin fibers that they probably really enjoy eating. Okay. Here's some of that newspaper we threw in here last time. We'll just set this aside. There's another piece of it right here, a fairly big chunk of it. So we'll just take the worms that are still in here, we'll just scoop them off to the side. Here's another piece of paper. Take these little guys too and move them off to the side. So I like kind of, you know, if you haven't noticed, I like kind of doing things in pairs, so I got kind of an opportunity to compare one to the other in terms of how they're progressing. So we'll set this one up in a similar fashion to what we just did on the last one. We're gonna go ahead and use this cleared out space to lay down some bedding material, and we'll just use this paper the way we used the fresh paper we did on the last bin. Sort of a foundation, and then next is going to come that old questionable moldy compost that we took out of finishing bin. I'm going to plop that down the middle here. It is pretty dry, so I'm assuming it's also going to help dry the bin out a bit as well as it absorbs moisture. Then, like we did before, we'll just take some of these in progress, older, slow composting food items, drop them down into the middle section. Got it all. Good. And we'll provide a nice generous amount of grit before we introduce the fresh food. After we spread it out a bit, we'll go ahead and we'll top it off with some coffee. Once again, just like before, it's a nice generous helping of food. And then we'll, if I'm not mistaken, this is where the majority of the worms were, so we'll just bring them back over right on top of where we want them to be, like so. And then I'm just going to go off to the edges here a little bit and kind of inspect how things are looking, and at the same time try to aerate it up a little bit. The material's got some nice moisture content to it out here on the sides. See how the stuff looks down under here as well. Wow, lots of worms over on this side. I wonder what was over there that had drawn their attention. So whatever it was, they must have really enjoyed it. There's tons of worms over there. Super busy bin. Kind of surprised to actually find uncomposted food in a bin like this with so many worms. Alright, so we're just going to spread things out here a little bit, and I think like before we're going to live with the fact that there's kind of a mound in the middle just based on the large amount of stuff we just introduced with that old compost and with all that food. So the fact that there's a little bit of a mound in the middle shouldn't be a big deal. I would think that by next week, next time we check in on this bin, that mound's going to be worked down pretty good. let's get this thing covered up too. One more. Okay, so when we work on this bin, I usually lay this down underneath it just to prop it up so that there's a chance for you guys to see what I'm doing here as well. So like I mentioned earlier, this is a bin, kind of a nursery bin, that has European night crawlers in it. And I was sort of just taking a precautionary measure by also trying to set up a sort of a baiting zone for mites, just in case mites decide they want to move into here as well. So the last time I fed, I really just treated a big pile of leaves on top was their last feeding. All right, yeah, I'm just gonna scoop it out and rest it off to the side temporarily. And we'll just put that right back on top when we're done feeding. Trying to remember what this was. Oh, I remember now. Rice. I had taken a big wad of rice and I figured, well, let's see how they like rice. And I don't know, it doesn't look like it's too popular. I don't see many worms in it. In fact, I don't see any worms in it. So I'm gonna just sort of blend it in with the rest of the stuff that they're occupying right now. And hopefully at some point they're gonna take a liking to it and eat it. But what else we have down here are a couple other slow composting sort of items, like this piece of corn cob. And I thought there was another one, and there is, but it's very small. They're definitely working it down. Nice small corn cob. I'm just gonna sort of push things off to the side just a little bit here. And what I'm actually gonna do is take a handful of that stuff that we just pulled off the top and lay it down here over here. And we're going to start treating that as a bedding material for them down here. And then I'm going to actually roll the whole wad over on top of that, like so, and just grab the remainder of it and plop that down here. And you know, at some point I might want to consider relocating these little guys into something a little bit bigger, because this is kind of cramped as far as dealing with this container. So it's sort of resting on top of a material that we can consider as bedding. So I'm just going to clear open the middle of it now. Like so. I'm going to take some of these coffee filters that I have. I have a little bit of a surplus of these coffee filters. And I'd like to introduce them down into the pit here, down into the bottom as bedding for them. So I'm just going to wrinkle up a couple of them and drop those down into the hole for them, sort of as a foundation for that food that I'm going to add, like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and drop in this fairly generous feeding for them. And I sure hope it isn't too much. So a couple ends of romaine lettuce, a little bit of mushroom chunks, a banana peel, and we'll go ahead and give them some grit as well. And then I've got one more coffee filter that I'll just kind of rest on top over here before I reintroduce these two older in progress corn cobs that we pulled out of here earlier. And then I'll just sort of spread things around here a little bit. Okay. All right, and then here on top, I'll give them some fresh dry leaves scattered across the top. These leaves are dry, but as the stuff underneath starts to melt, the moisture from that will work its way up and dampen all this stuff for them nicely. Should make for a pretty comfortable space for them And then I'm just going to restore this sort of countermeasure here. I don't know if it's working or not, or if it's necessary for that matter, but whatever. I'm just going to go ahead and put things back the way I had them. So, okay, that's it for today. I'll clean up around here because there's a little bit of a mess, but I won't keep you around for that. That's no fun. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your company. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider signing up to be a subscriber to the channel. That's always appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Bye now.